Good evening. Okay, good evening. Hi, everybody. I'm Sherry Gleed. I'm Dean of NYU Wagner, and welcome to our new home here at 105 East 17th Street, across the street from Tammany Hall. Um, I am, it really is. I am delighted to thank our co-presenters here, Vital City and NYU's Institute of Public Knowledge. Tonight, you're going to hear a conversation between Matt Yglesias, journalist, and Jens Ludwig, a behavioral scientist. Is that what is a behavioral scientist at the University of Chicago, to explore Jens's new book, Unforgiving Places: The Unexpected Origins of American Gun Violence. I can't. You all know that this is an extremely timely topic. Gun violence in American cities has been at the center of public concern, especially since the pandemic, as shooting rates went up. Public perception often lags statistics. Last week, the NYPD announced triumphantly that shooting incidents had fallen to an all-time low, and murders were the second lowest number ever. But before we get too excited, there were still 13 shooting incidents and 5 murders that week. And even at half full, at any reasonable distance, that glass looks pretty empty. Jens's innovative solutions have mattered in bringing down shooting rates and show us how we can go even further. We're delighted to bring you this really important conversation, and it's all because of the really impressive work of Vital City. So I'm particularly delighted to introduce Liz Glazer, the genius behind Vital City, the founder of Vital City. She previously served as the justice advisor to a New York City mayor and a New York governor. We're not going to name them. And earlier as a federal prosecutor. And she is also, I'm pleased to say, a past NYU Wagner distinguished visiting urbanist. Welcome, Liz Glazer.
This is going to be quite a feat of coordination, so I'll put my pen away. So, Jerry, and thanks to Wagner, and thanks to Eric Kleinenberg and the Institute for Public Knowledge. First and most important, I would run, not walk, to the back of the room to get Jens's book, while supplies last. And if you have to buy online, here's a word to the wise. When you buy Jens's book, make sure that you also buy John Grisham's The Firm. 7 million copies sold. So if you love John Grisham, you're going to love Jens Ludwig. Second, I don't want to be a spoiler for the terrific conversation I know we're going to have, but I do want to say this. Sometimes there are books that completely rearrange your assumptions about how the world works and how things go or don't go and what you thought you knew. So that it's almost impossible to reconstruct afterwards what you thought in the before times. And it's like, looking at one of those drawings where, yeah, I can see that's a witch. And then it turns out, no, there's a duck lurking there. And this is really what Jens's book does in the most extraordinary way. Don't worry, there are only like 20 pages of comments here. And it just makes you think about the way in which we can defeat gun violence is possible. And there's a route, and it's actually quite different from what we've been doing for decades. And these days, when the room seems to not stop spinning as government is driven off a cliff, and we're definitely living in a Tom and Daisy world in which everything is being smashed up and not in a good way, and when there seems to be a repeating echo of war is peace and ignorance is strength, it's hard to remember what a central and important issue gun violence is and the challenge that it poses to flourishing cities. So at a time when I think many people are wondering, what can I do? Taking up Jens's challenge of a way to break through the floor of gun violence in many cities, making Chicago and Baltimore and other places safe, could take the wind out of the sails of some of the narrative that we're hearing these days. So we already know who Jens and who Matt are. So my incredibly over-the-top praise of both of you, we can skip. But the last thing I just wanted to say is, in addition to racing to the back of the room to buy Jens's book, also please do pick up copies of Vital Cities anniversary issue. We also try to stop the room from spinning with angelic prose, deep insight, stunning graphics and photos. And so enjoy. Can't wait to hear your conversation.
Fantastic. Hello. Welcome, everybody. I want to thank so much to NYU Wagner School, Vital City, for hosting this event. This is a real thrill for me. I grew up in this neighborhood on 12th Street, University Place, always around NYU stuff all my life, and always wanted to play at Irving Plaza someday. This is close, as close as I'm ever going to come. So that's great. So, Jens, it's a fantastic book. The subtitle talks about the unexpected origins of gun violence in America. But I think, the expected origin, one of the most expected origins, is that, if you compare the United States to all other sort of developed countries, just systematically much higher level of murder, of lethality, and clearly related to the much broader prevalence of guns in the United States. You have crime in England, but you don't have nearly as much shootings, and so you don't have nearly as many people being killed.
Yeah. Before I answer that, let me also thank you for coming up to do this. I'm a long-time, slow, boring reader. I'm not sure if that makes this a conflict of interest or not, but I'm so delighted that you're here to do this. So when you look at the United States compared to any other rich country in the world, our murder rate is just literally off the charts. You don't even comparing the United States to countries that you don't think of as like being super well run, like Turkey.
Mhm.
People in Turkey are looking at the murder rate in the United States and thinking to themselves, like, what the fuck is going on in America? Really, like, our murder rate is more than double on a per capita basis what they have in Turkey. Like, this would be a national crisis anywhere else. And when you break out our murder rate per capita into gun and non-gun murders, you see almost all the American exceptionalism is murders with guns. Now, in principle, we have something like 330 million people. We have something like 400 million guns in the United States. In principle, those guns could drive down crime as well as drive it up. So the same thing that makes guns useful in self-defense, in principle, the same thing that makes guns useful for committing crimes, in principle, makes them useful for self-defense. On net, the data suggests that more guns the crime-inducing effect winds up dominating. So more guns, more murders. So gun availability is clearly part of our story. And if you had a button that you could push to get rid of all 400 million guns in the United States and you pushed it, that would have big beneficial public health effects. The challenge is that nobody has that button. And if you just look at the politics in DC, gun control is not going to be changing anytime soon at the national level. So I think one of the arguments of the book is like the good news that there are two paths out of the gun violence problem, not just one. I think a lot of people look at the gun control debate and think it's stuck. There's nothing you can do. But gun violence is guns plus violence. So not just widespread gun availability, but the willingness of people to use guns to hurt other people. And I think it's that second path that gives us some grounds for optimism.
Yeah, I think it's important for people to sort of understand, because clearly if you could make all the guns vanish, that would have a huge impact on the level of lethal violence. But you can't. And politically, we're in a very constrained space. But we do have a lot of still political talk about sort of marginal changes to gun laws. And one of the things you talk about in the early sections of the book is what are the limits of that kind of thing? Because you could imagine a world where, okay, only a small change is politically feasible, but it makes a big difference, and that builds momentum for more and more things. But the vast bulk of the kind of violence that you're talking about is taking place with like ordinary handguns, right? Not with the like special guns that people want to ban. And they're often illicitly obtained. So they're not going to be really affected by background checks and this kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, maybe the other thing that I would add to that, Matt, is like one way to think about gun regulation in the United States is that federal law sets a floor, not a ceiling, on what cities and states can do. And so lots of places, including my hometown of Chicago, my home state of Illinois, enact gun laws that are much stricter than what the federal law has. You know, the problem with that is for a long time, I lived on the south side of Chicago. My family's favorite ice cream place was Dairy Bell in Hammond, Indiana. We would regularly drive a half hour. You might think nobody would drive a half hour to Indiana for ice cream. Our family definitely would drive easily a half hour for, if you had Dairy Bell, you'd drive a half hour for ice cream too. So we'd regularly go to Dairy Bell. We'd drive home. Nobody checks what's in the trunk of our car coming from Indiana back into Chicago. And it turns out the reason that's relevant is, you know, when you look at the crime guns that are confiscated on the streets of Chicago, almost none of them originally were bought at a Chicago gun store. And some hugely disproportionate share of crime guns in Chicago, it comes from like 5 stores, one of which is Cabello's. I don't know if I'm pronouncing this, the big hunting store in Hammond, Indiana, that you pass on the way to Dairy Bell, right? And so I think the way that I've come to think about gun regulation is it's a lot like environmental regulation, where like what the factories are doing in Gary, Indiana matters a lot for air quality in Chicago. In the environmental area, we realize in a place where you have these sort of cross-jurisdiction spillovers, the only solution is national regulation, not local regulation. And so I think there are reasons to hypothesize that national laws might have much bigger impacts than local and state laws, but I think the fact that we have these open city and state borders really sets a limit to how much local regulation
Yeah,
can do.
and particularly to the extent that progressive-minded people might see gun regulation as an alternative to incredibly draconian policing, the only way to actually stop people, you know, you could like search everybody's car or something like that, right? But that has all the same problems as anything else you might do. So your book really takes a behavioral economics perspective. And I think that what we were talking about, that, you know, in principle, everybody having guns could lead to less violence. But in fact, we see more violence. And that's because I think most of this violence is not like hyper rational, where people are saying, wow, these other guys might have guns, so I better be really careful. It's more people are mad, they're lashing out. And if you have a gun, your lashing out is much deadlier.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like in some ways, the argument of the book seems super simple and maybe like almost stupidly obvious. But if you think about the conventional wisdom that we've had in the United States for literally 100 years, like everybody on the right has thought of the gun violence problem as being due to characterologically bad people who are unafraid of whatever the criminal justice system is going to do to them. And that leads you to think that the only solution is to disincentivize gun violence by threatening people with ever stiffer prison penalties. People on the left have thought of the gun violence problem as being due to economic desperation, people doing whatever it takes to feed their family and whatever. So the only solution is to disincentivize crime by ending poverty, kind of thing. And, you know, if you go back to the 1930s, that's what like the Democrat and Republican presidential candidates were arguing about that. So just like today. So we've had the same argument for 100 years. The murder rate has shown no long-term progress. Almost every leading cause of death in America has plummeted since 1900, yet the murder rate today is almost exactly what it was in 1900. So this sort of back and forth argument that we've been having is unfortunately sort of a path to nowhere. And I think part of the breakthrough is to recognize that like the thing that the left and the right have in common is the implicit view, as you're saying, the implicit view that before anyone pulls a trigger, they're doing some sort of like Gary Becker rational benefit cost calculation in their head. And that's just not what you see. Like most shootings are not premeditated. Most shootings in America are not motivated by economic considerations. And so like, no wonder that these incentives that are fixated on changing incentives these policies that are fixated on changing incentives haven't had the big impacts we thought.
And you have some statistics in the book about the prevalence of sort of robbery murders in the media versus in reality, right? And there's a very obviously it does happen. People use threats of violence to rob people. Sometimes that leads to actual violence. It's a real occurrence, but it's a quite small share of the actual gun violence that's taking place.
Yeah, exactly. So I think, what most people understand about gun violence comes from what we get from the media, so news and entertainment. And that definitely gives us a non-representative picture of what shootings in America are. So gun gun robbery murders are way overrepresented, so I think it's something like, 5, 10, 15% at most, depending on the city and the time, are robbery related murders. And even gang wars over drug selling turf, right, is the thing that dominates, every time there's like a federal takedown of a drug selling gang in Chicago, this plays out on the newspaper headline for weeks and weeks and weeks as the RICO trial goes on. So of course everybody's going to think that's the problem, but that also turns out to be just a small share of all shootings that happen in America.
And so you talk in the book about sort of two neighborhoods that are adjacent in Chicago and are fairly similar, but have quite different violence outcomes. And that's sort of it's not a book about these neighborhoods, but that's the frame through which you explore these ideas. So can you tell people about them?
Yeah. So, the book was motivated partly by looking at the lack of long-term progress on the murder problem. And so I lived for many, many years on the south side of Chicago and see this problem up close. You can see this is the problem in Chicago, and not just Chicago, so many American cities. And I came to the conclusion, like, there's really something that conventional wisdom is missing. It seems like a key explanation for why we haven't made more progress in comparing what's going on in the South Shore neighborhood on the South Side compared to Greater Grand Crossing. So these are two neighborhoods. They're just like, one neighborhood separates them from Hyde Park, which is where the University of Chicago is, if you're not familiar with the city of Chicago. And they're literally right across Dorchester Avenue from one another. So if you think about the conventional wisdom of the right, you would say, so it turns out that shootings are twice as common in Greater Grand Crossing on a per capita basis as in South Shore. So if you're on the right, you would say, I can see I'm thinking that it's the criminal justice system is just too wimpy. That's the problem. But the two neighborhoods are served by exactly the same criminal justice system. That can't be it, right? And if you're on the left, you would say, you have sort of a poverty deterministic sort of perspective of the gun violence problem. The poverty rates are almost exactly the same in the two neighborhoods, and the level of racial segregation is almost exactly the same. So conventional wisdom can't explain this 2x difference in these super similar neighborhoods. And I thought, like, if we don't understand that, of course we're not going to be able to make progress on solving the larger problem.
Right. And so, I spent some time in Chicago. This is when we met a couple years ago. I did a fellowship at the University of Chicago, and Hyde Park is a fascinating place. It's this kind of the university's there, and there's extra security and a kind of thriving retail ecology, but it's surrounded on all sides by neighborhoods that are sort of in much worse shape. But Chicago's really like a great city in so many ways. I mean, it has incredible amenities. I grew up in New York. I moved to DC. Chicago has a lot of what I miss about New York. It's radically more affordable than any of our coastal cities. It's got sort of great traditional urbanism, but you go, I walked to the Green Line stop on 51st Street against the advice of, my minders and stuff there. And, things get bleak like really fast, right? And the lack of public safety is really, I think, a root cause of economic problems and not just vice versa, right? That if people felt, well, you could get a great bargain on a house by going just a few blocks in some direction, and have access to all the great things of Chicago, like they would do that. And then stores would open and restaurants would open and people could get jobs there, and you'd have a really kind of positive spiral. But instead, you have a lot of focus in the local politics of the city where it's like, well, we're gonna like end poverty in the south side of Chicago, and they just like they can't.
Yeah.
Right, like very well-intentioned mayors and some not so well-intentioned ones, like that problem is too hard,
Yeah, exactly. So, we'll come back to what winds up distinguishing South Shore from Greater Grand Crossing. But on this point, it's like I've heard so many politicians, policymakers in Chicago say some version of, we will never solve the gun violence problem if we don't solve poverty, which would be horribly depressing, like a humanitarian catastrophe if that were true. Right. Because if you look at the trends for poverty in Chicago, like that would make you think that the city is just doomed to this terrible public health crisis for years, decades, whatever. I think so there's been a ton of understandable focus on the causal arrow from poverty to causing gun violence, because when you look in the news, you look around the city of Chicago, where's the gun violence concentrated? Not in the rich neighborhoods. I think we haven't paid as much attention, to your point, Matt, we haven't paid nearly as much attention to the causal arrow going in the other direction of what a huge headwind gun violence is for community development, right? And I actually like, so one way to think about this is neighborhoods can get caught in vicious cycles where, my University of Chicago colleague, Steve Levitt, wrote a paper many years ago that shows that every murder that happens in a city reduces the city's population by 70 people. Right. That's people moving out and fewer people moving in. And the same thing happens with businesses. And so you have gun violence that drives people and businesses out, that deprives the neighborhood of every resource you can imagine, which leads to more gun violence and so on. And so, a natural thing that cities often try and do is arrest that decline by investing in economic development, as the city of Chicago did many years ago by putting millions and millions of dollars to subsidize a Whole Food to go into Englewood, one of the most high violence neighborhoods on the south side of Chicago. And 5 years later, and many, many millions of dollars later, the Whole Foods winds up closing. And I think we have lots of examples around Chicago that if you start at the reverse end and you get the gun violence problem under control first, that goes from being a huge headwind for economic development to being a huge tailwind. It makes everything else that you want to do to develop community so much easier.
And you talk in the book about the Moving to Opportunity program, which I think provides some good behavioral evidence, but it's also a reality check, right? I mean, if you are very poor and you're stuck living in an incredibly unsafe neighborhood and you are given some economic resources, like you're going to leave. Like people don't want to live in high crime neighborhoods. But part of the good news, at least as individuals, is if you can get people out of a high violence context, that changes their behavior, right? They don't need to be like turned into a whole different kind of person, but just switching what their surroundings are changes how they behave.
Yeah, exactly. So the moving opportunity experiment that Matt mentions, a million years ago, back in the 1890s, when I started as an assistant professor, the first project I worked on was a residential mobility experiment that HUD ran, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, called Moving Opportunity. They took families living in some of the most dangerous, lowest income housing projects in the country, and via lottery, they offered some the chance to move to a lower poverty neighborhood with a housing voucher. And, one of the big debates over the 20th century, especially on the heels of World War II, was like World War II, I think, caused a huge debate within social science about what is wrong with the German people for them to be able to do this. Led to a big debate in social psychology about how much of behavior is due to the person versus the situation. And that has been playing out for decades and decades. And the Moving to Opportunity study showed that when you take families out of really distressed housing projects, in Chicago, it was the Robert Taylor homes on State Street. You've probably seen pictures of these, notorious 13-story buildings for miles. You take families out of that environment and you move them literally a couple miles in any direction to a more, diverse neighborhood like Hyde Park, you see huge reductions in crime involvement, especially violence involvement. And I think that really speaks to the idea that the social environment matters a lot, as people on the left have been arguing for a long time. And I think maybe the addition of the book is to point out that aspects of the social environment matter a lot beyond just the really hard to change features of the social environment, like economic disadvantage and racial segregation. There are other things about neighborhoods that are easier to change that can wind up making a big difference.
Right. So let's go back to South Shore versus Greater Grand Crossing, right? Because that's sort of the point there, right? There's violence in Greater Grand Crossing in large part because there's so much violence
Yeah.
there, right? It's an endemic cycle that perpetuates. But what makes those neighborhood environments different?
Yeah, I think that there are, I argue in the book that there are two types of things, two categories of things that make Greater Grand Crossing very different from South Shore. And the first is, if you go back 60 years and you look at Jane Jacobs's wonderful book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities. So she's looking around New York City and she's seeing 60 years ago, look, there are similarly poor neighborhoods in New York that vary enormously in their crime and violence rates. What's going on? Jane Jacobs is saying, Jane Jacobs, think that it's eyes on the street, people around who are willing to step in and intervene, interrupt stuff. I just want to point out that Jane Jacobs argument makes no sense under conventional wisdom. Like if you think that crime and violence is due to either characterologically bad people or to people who are economically desperate, that conventional wisdom implies that people are going to be persistently super motivated to engage in crime. Right? You're either a super predator or you're doing this to feed your family. You're going to wait for the eyes on the street to go around the corner. And then, so conventional wisdom would say anything that interrupts violence merely delays violence. The behavioral economics perspective on violence argues that this is much more the result, not of the slow, deliberate part of your brain, but rather the fast, automatic part of your brain, that motivation is much more fleeting. And it would suggest that anything that interrupts violence can prevent violence. And since Jane Jacobs, we've had a bunch of randomized experimental evidence now that confirms that she was right. So the experimental revolution in social science confirms that she was right. And the behavioral economics revolution in social science gives us a way to understand why she was right, fleeting motivation. And so going back to South Shore and Greater Grand Crossing, one of the key things that's different there, if you don't know Chicago geography, South Shore, through an accident of geography, it's right along the very best part of Chicago, which is Lake Michigan. And because of that, there's just tons more commercial development in South Shore than there is in Greater Grand Crossing. So there are tons more people who have reason to leave their house and go to the grocery store and go to a restaurant and whatever it is. So I think that's one big part of the story for why South Shore is so different, even though economically it's similar to Greater Grand Crossing. I think the other explanation is suggested by a wonderful book that my friends Sendhil Mullainathan and Eldar Shafir wrote several years ago called Scarcity, where if you sort of think about the way we think of thinking as like the little voice in our head. That's sort of slow thinking, what Danny Kahneman in his wonderful book, Thinking Fast and Slow, called System 2 thinking. That is the part of our brain that's rational, deliberate. That turns out to be super mentally taxing. And so our minds do very little of that. Our minds are designed to do a second type of thinking that we're not even aware of. Kahneman calls this System 1. It's a bunch of automatic, fast thinking responses that happen below the level of consciousness. And those automatic responses are designed to usually be helpful for low stakes routine things that we come across, but can lead us into trouble when they're overgeneralized. And Sendhil and Eldar argue that when people are in situations of stress, that taxes mental bandwidth and pushes you to rely more on this sort of System 1 automatic thinking, which makes you more prone to mistakes. So what is more mentally taxing in Greater Grand Crossing than South Shore? Just to take one example, one of many examples, if you look at COVID mortality, for instance, in Greater Grand Crossing, it was substantially higher than it was in South Shore. And so when you're driving around Greater Grand Crossing, the set of people who are grieving the loss of a family member, a friend, a neighbor, whatever it is, just as one example, is going to be much, much higher in Greater Grand Crossing. So people are going to be much more likely to have to rely on System 1 automatic. Another analogy that I use to sort of illustrate what's going on comes from poker. When you talk to poker players, what they describe is, when you talk to poker players, they say one of the key things that gets them where they can see their improvement in poker very quickly is when you play poker and you get frustrated, you start to play emotionally rather than rationally. and you just start doing a terrible job. And the saying that poker players have for this is going on tilt. After a pinball machine, if you smack it or you tilt it, it gives you a tilt error message, right? And poker players talk about like learning to recognize that they're going on tilt as one of the key things that helps them get better very quickly. And I think one way to think about that is like, that is people going off of their sort of slow thinking rational selves and into their sort of automatic emotional selves. And if you're a poker player, the downside risk is you just lose some money at the poker table. If you're a 16-year-old kid growing up in Greater Grand Crossing and you get that wrong and there's like guns and gangs and drugs everywhere, the downside risk is much, much greater.
And then the part of this is like, what is your automatic response to certain kinds of stressful situations, right? If somebody is being rude to you or is disrespecting you or looks at you like what do you do, right? Like what's the learned instinctive response? And there's environments where people respond to aggression or perceived aggression with more aggression,
Yeah.
right? It's a survival mechanism.
Yeah, exactly. So let me sort of highlight what Matt is driving at by thinking about like my own family's experience in Hyde Park compared to the other neighborhoods around it. So, we lived like 3 blocks. My kids went to the lab school at the University of Chicago campus. We lived about 3 blocks from school. And as Matt alluded to before, the University of Chicago basically puts a private security guard on almost every street corner in Hyde Park. So my kids walking to lab school literally passed 2 or 3 unarmed private security guards, plus a University of Chicago police officer standing in front of lab school, and they're all super bored. If somebody were to challenge my kid on the way to school and demand their lunch money, they would literally never be more than a half a block from an adult who would find it to be the highlight of their day to do something about that, right? And so my kids learn very quickly, like somebody challenges you walking around Hyde Park, the optimal thing to do, your system 1 is very quickly trained, the optimal thing to do is comply and tell an adult. But like in contrast, let me, one of the stories that made experiences that made a very big impression on me is I was driving around one night with the commander in the Englewood police districts on the south side of Chicago. We're on 63rd Street. It's a 4-lane road, 2 lanes in each direction. There's a Friday night, there's a car in front of us that's literally swerving across all 4 lanes. And I turned to the police commander and I said, I think that guy's drunk. And the commander turned to me and he had hit the brakes and we're like putting distance between us and the other car. I said, I think that guy's drunk. And the commander said, I do too. And I said, aren't you going to do anything? You're not just the cops. You're the cop. This is your district. You can do it. And he was like, Jens, if I stopped every drunk driver in Englewood on a Friday night, I wouldn't have time to worry about the real problem here, which is the gun violence. And that made a really big impression because this echoes what you hear a lot in the sociological literature, what we hear a lot from teachers and social workers and nonprofit organizations, which is like in distressed, high violence neighborhoods, the adults that provide sort of social control in places like Hyde Park are just overwhelmed. So if you're a kid growing up in a neighborhood like Englewood or Greater Grand Crossing or on and on, your system 1 fast thinking learns a very different optimal automatic response when you get challenged for your lunch money, which is you learn that if I hand over my lunch money in Englewood, there's going to be no adult that's going to be able to help me. So I learn that if I hand over my lunch money today, tomorrow I'm going to have to hand over my coat. The day after that, it's my phone, and I'm done. So your system 1 learns when I'm challenged, I push back. And the pushback need not be proportional to the provocation because it's not retribution for what you just did. It's not backward looking, it's forward looking. I'm signaling to everybody else in the neighborhood that I'm not an easy victim, right? And you can sort of see it's not that like believe me, my kids are not do not have more self-control than teenagers growing up anywhere else in Chicago. It's that their system ones are trained very differently because the environment gives them very different cues.
Yeah, I mean, I was rushing here from Penn Station, and I was a little confused. I was like handing my son off to his grandfather, and I spun around, and I kind of like hit a guy with my bag, by accident in a crowded situation. I felt embarrassed, and I apologized, but I was also like quite sure he wasn't going to shoot me as a response. But if I'd done that at the Green Line stop on 51st Street, like I'd be in terror of my life, right? Because it's a different environment, right? Where there's less social control, right? There's fewer people around, and you expect that like aggression may be met with disproportionate response because everyone's trying to show that they're tough, that like don't fuck with me because I don't want to be a victim because there's other perpetrators of
Yeah,
bad stuff
exactly. I
happening.
mean, and so part of what the neighborhoods are doing is like put you at more or less. This is why the book's title is Unforgiving Places. Like some neighborhoods put you at greatly elevated risk for going on tilt. But it's also the case that some neighborhoods are much less forgiving once you're on tilt. And so in the book, the book is full of super embarrassing stories with me as the main character. So like I tell a story in the book about like every Wednesday morning I would leash up my dog Aiko and put on my sneakers and put on my AirPods, and I would take my dog Aiko for a walk around Hyde Park. One day I'm taking her for a walk, and some neighbor has their dog off leash and comes tearing down the driveway, like fangs bared, barking like a hellhound, And so like the owner of the dog was another University of Chicago faculty member whose kids went to my kid's school, right? So the rational part of my brain would be like and I've got my leadership, the other sort of senior people on my research center on the phone with me. So the rational self would have said, there are lots of ways out of this problem. You do not want to embarrass yourself. Pick your dog up, stand between the other dog and my dog, like whatever. That is not what the actual self did in that situation, right? It's like, one of the things that all of our minds do is something called catastrophizing, right? It's like your very fast, effortless, fast thinking self comes up with a very quick assessment of what's going on, and it only has 2 notches on that mental dial, totally fine or end of the world. My system one decided that dog about to attack my dog was the end of the world, and by construction, anything is better than the end of the world. And so I literally used every 4, 7, and 12-letter word I knew to scream at this fellow University of Chicago. I was like, you stupid, dumb motherfucker. If this ever happens again, I swear to fucking God, I totally lost it in front of all the neighbors in Hyde Park, this fellow faculty member and lab school parent, and everybody on the senior leadership team of my. And the thing that saved us here, and then I'm sort of like a 5-year-old kid hopped up on sugar. I'm like, this is expected behavior from me. He's like an adult and he does the same thing back to me because he's thinking, who are you? This was clearly an accident. My dog slipped their leash. And here you are saying all these horrible things to me in front of my house where my wife and my kids are. And so he starts yelling at me. And the thing that saved us was a security guard drove by and stepped in and said, is everything all right? Or do I need to call the university police? And I was like, please break this up. And like, that was it. But to just show, right, it's not just the varying light, like we will all go on tilt sometime, and we don't all have somebody there to step in and sort of save us from ourselves.
So this one question is, I mean, how do we operationalize these insights, right? I mean, because the University of Chicago has they've created a private university police force that patrols the residential neighborhoods surrounding the campus. They then supplement them with all these like guys in vests, your security guards. And it does work, right? I mean, it's like a very chill vibe. And if you come as a guest, they like give you a map, right? And it's like, don't cross any of these boundaries or we can't account for your safety, but within this rectangle, like you're good. So that works, but it's very resource intensive. if you're the mayor of, Cleveland, whatever, low income, high violence city, you want to turn things around. I mean, what can you really do to sort of bring these behavioral insights to bear?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think, if you're New York City is doing an amazing job on public safety relative to Chicago and Philadelphia and Detroit. So if you look at cities like Chicago, other places like that around the country, this is the big problem. And every city around the country is trying to think about how to address this problem in a world in which they are going to be super resource constrained for the foreseeable future. So think of your own, whatever your politics, think of your own favorite sort of solution to the crime problem. More cops, more prisons if you're on the right, more social programs and school spending and Head Start and drug treatment and whatever on the left, and throw that all out the window, right? Throw that all out the window because cities are going to be flat broke for the foreseeable future. I think this behavioral economics perspective gives us a reason for hope. And I think that there are sort of two really pragmatic, like zero cost paths out of this trap, this super highly constrained optimization problem that cities are trying to. So many years ago, we did a study with the Juvenile Detention Center on the west side of Chicago. This is where the juvenile justice system in Cook County holds the kids that they think are the highest risk. And, a federal judge had just taken over. We were talking to the temporary administrator, working with the judge. He was saying like the kids go to school in the morning and then they spend all afternoon just watching TV, and we've got a guard standing along the wall just watching them watch TV to make sure that they don't. And he was like, we should, behavioral economics has taught us about how to implement social programs that can teach people to not be on tilt. And so he was like, why don't we don't have any money to do anything. Why don't we train the detention staff to run a program like that? The bar to clear is this developmentally better for kids than watching TV? It can't be worse. So we tried that, and it wound up reducing recidivism rates by like 20%. Now you might look at that and think, I'm not impressed by a 20% reduction, but think, if I can find 5 things that are free and reduce crime by 20%, I'm really cooking at that point, right? And I think the lesson from that is there are a bunch of institutions that have low value added time with lots and lots of young people where we could train existing staff to deliver programs like that at zero cost. And like every detention facility in the country could be doing this at zero cost. And, I went to Lenape High School in Bedford, New Jersey, and they made me take health class for 4 years. It's like, eat more broccoli, sleep 8 hours a night, don't drink, and here's where babies come from.
Right.
That sounds a lot like low value added time to me as well. Like, why aren't we taking 15 to 20 hours of the 4-year health curriculum and infusing this in there as well?
And then I think, another thing that comes out of this, right, is if you believe that progress is possible, and that you can make these kinds of changes, that you generate virtuous circles, hopefully, right? That if a lot of the kind of learned response, or you were talking about the drunk drivers, right? I mean, if authority figures, if responsible people are overwhelmed, problems cascade. If you can get a 20% reduction through some cognitive behavioral therapy, then you can free up like more people's time to, be responsible.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that a ton of cities are sitting on unrealized potential for eyes on the street and not making use of data. So I think this has become like a very kind of a third rail thing in a lot of cities. I think leaving some social good opportunities on the table. So let me just give, I think some of you may be familiar with the idea that it turns out that there's a lot of predictable structure for when and where violence happens in time and place. And to see why, there's a liquor store at 57th and State Street on the south side of Chicago that's open till midnight. Almost every other liquor store in Chicago closes at 10 p.m. And so up until 10 p.m., everybody from the south side is going to their local liquor store, buying their alcohol there. Between 10 and midnight, everybody from all over the city, these people have beef with these guys because of this thing. And, all of a sudden, all of these people who hate each other are converging in the lobby of Ike's Liquors at 57th and State. And if you look at the data, you can see a huge spike in shootings in that 2-hour period right at 57th and State. And it happens night after night after night after night, right? And so like, we don't have, the Chicago Police Department has something like 2,000 or 3,000 police officers in a city of 2.7 million people on duty, on patrol at any point in time, at best. They can't be everywhere. Why are we not using data to put a cop at 57th and State between 10 and midnight? Why aren't we putting a violence interrupter at 57th and State between 10 and midnight every year? There's a wonderful randomized experiment out of Los Angeles that shows that using data to target rather than using sort of our half-baked human intuition can double the amount of crime prevention that you get from the money that cities are already spending on eyes on the street, cops, violence interrupters, that sort of stuff. That also feels to me like we are on the steep part of the returns curve there, like low-hanging fruit to make neighborhoods more forgiving by putting the eyes on the street where we most need them.
And some of that is that if your model of crime is that it's a rational or like a quasi-rational like scheme to get away with stuff, you would think, well, it doesn't matter where the cop is because the criminal will just go where the cop isn't. Right. But if you're saying, look, this is interpersonal disputes that happen to arise at a liquor store, because of schedules, then no, it actually makes a huge difference, right? That like there are lots of corners where the presence or absence of a police officer isn't going to matter. And that if you can deflect, delay, in a sense, the conflict, it just evaporates.
Yeah, exactly. And that just seems like, using data and targeting relative to anything else that you can do, using data and targeting resources is like the lowest cost thing that you can imagine. And it's just such a sort of a multiplier of city dollars that you already have.
And so what we're here in New York, I mean, the book discusses Chicago extensively, and New York in some ways, I feel like is an over-discussed city. I mean, it's large, the media's here, but it's actually an outlier in terms of public safety, but it got that way in part through this very intensive use of data, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, it's almost impossible to imagine from a 2025 perspective, but if you rewind the clock to 1991, the murder rate in Chicago and New York were almost identical. About 30 murders per 100,000 city residents. By way of comparison, the murder rate per 100,000 in London is usually between like 1 and 1.5. Just to benchmark how insane 30 murders per 100,000 people is, right? And so a lot of your favorite explanations for why New York has higher population density, not as close to Indiana, like whatever it is, that was as true in 1991 as it is in 2025. So that takes a huge number of candidate explanations for the safety difference today off the table, right? I think, when you talk to people lots and lots of public safety experts are of the view, and I think the data are very consistent with this. Two of the things that LA did that really wind up mattering a lot were being early and rapid adopters of data-driven policing, sort of they did a bunch of other stuff that may or may not have been helpful, but they were also early and rapid adopters of that, using data to put police resources in the right place, and also early and rapid adopters of community violence intervention, of violence interrupters, compared to what other cities are doing still now to catch up. And I think it's very plausible that helps explain a big part of why the murder rate in Chicago today is not that different from what it was in 1991. And in fact, if you look at the predominantly Black neighborhoods in Chicago, the murder rate is, if anything, higher than it was in 1991 at the peak of the crack epidemic. And in contrast, the murder rate in New York has declined by something like 90%. There's no city in America that would not be thrilled, would do anything to get a 90% reduction in murders.
Right. And so tell me about, you've alluded to violence interrupters a couple of times. I mean, how does that work? And what do you see the benefits as?
Yeah, my friend Chico, I talk in the book about this amazing guy who works at the crime lab now, who's a friend of mine who was in prison for many years, and then he was a violence interrupter. And, again, under conventional wisdom, the whole thing makes no sense, right? Because if you don't know what violence interruption, the theory about this is, it's like hire nonprofits who hire people who have some sense for what's going on in the community, And then they try and go out and sort of defuse and de-escalate these conflicts. And if these are conflicts over drug selling turf or something, then that's clearly not going to make a difference. If these are conflicts involving psychopathic super predators, that's clearly not going to make a difference. And when I asked Chico, like, what do you do? How in the world do you talk someone off the ledge if they're, and Chico says, basically, I just ask questions. Like, I just literally, he told me a story about like, there's a gang that stole a watch from some other gang, and then the gang who had and then they started to brag about it on social media. And so then the gang who had the watch stolen, they just start going through and killing person after person after person after person in the other gang. And Chico gets called in and he goes to talk to the head of the gang. And he says, what do you want? This is a very simple question, but like Chico's describing this is like had a very profound impact on the guy. He was like, oh, I actually did not, like, we've killed like 5 people now. Maybe that's enough. And then Chico says, like, if I have found out that you guys are behind this, don't you think that the police department will soon find out if they haven't already? And that wound up just diffusing things. So he doesn't come in and say, like, I'm telling you what to do. It's literally just, if you sort of think about system 1, system 2 thinking, it is really just about helping people reflect on what they themselves think is really in their best interest. Like, what would your system 2 do in this situation if it were really thinking about what you really wanted to do here?
I don't know. Well, so this is a federal law enforcement person was telling me that he found this vexing, that he felt that increasingly gangs are not, that people often think of gangs as involved in kind of commercial enterprise. I mean, illicit commerce, but trying to make money. And so you could try to deter them by saying, look, if you are committing acts of violence that are making headlines, like, we sort of have to come after you, right? But if you're like selling something behind closed doors, you get away with it. But then increasingly, he sees groups of young men involved in gangs that don't like have a purpose other than to fight with the other gangs. And he says he finds that struggle, a struggle to just like get federal law enforcement hooks into as a case, but how to deter people who are essentially like joining clubs whose point is to get into fights.
Yeah, I mean, like, you have perfectly put your finger on sort of the big problem and point of the book, which is like deterrence does not work. When I am standing there screaming at my neighbor, I am not deterrable, right? I'm clearly not thinking about the consequences of what's about to happen. I am fully on tilt. And for 100 years, we've built our whole policy strategy on the idea of incentives are going to be the thing that's going to prevent someone from pulling the trigger. And I think it just fundamentally misunderstands what the whole problem is.
Right, makes sense. I'll come to questions soon. But so how does this connect to? I mean, I know something that people have been talking about a lot in recent years is kind of like quality of life, policing type things, and I think there was a move away from that, from a sense that this involved bringing people into the criminal justice system who were not committing really serious offenses, and after a spike in shootings, it's sort of come back in vogue. And I wonder how that connects to the kinds of things you're talking about. I mean, I was reflecting, I was coming home from a Wizards game with my son when he was 9, and a guy, jumped it's not a turnstile in DC, it's a gate thing. And my son turned to me and he said, that was terrifying. And I said, well, what do you mean? Like, nothing happened. He's like, well, like, you all saw this guy and nobody did anything. And so suddenly it was like his whole world was upturned, and that made me rethink some of my kind of like priors around that.
Yeah, if you think maybe two responses, like if you think about one of the other things, so the psychology research suggests like one of the other things that's super stressful for people is disorder. And I think one of the things that we have, I was recently talking to someone who was a very high up at NYPD for a long time. And he said, we, the NYPD, did the world a disservice by conflating two different things: broken windows policing, which is worrying about disorder, and zero tolerance policing, which is like arresting everybody for every little thing. And I think in principle, there are lots of things that cities can do to address disorder. Like, you guys know in New York, you've got a bunch of subway gate type things that you can't jump. They're often on the exit. I don't quite understand why that is. But what's that? Yeah, no, it's, but there are a bunch of things that you can use to control disorder that don't involve making tons of arrests. I think the other thing that I would just say is, I think police themselves, and nobody has really understood what it is exactly that police do. You can see in the data that when you hire more police, crime goes down. But nobody has really understood sort of the mechanism through which that works. Like, people are like, oh, it must be deterrence. The average Chicago cop makes 3 arrests a year. 3 arrests a year, right? It's very hard to believe, for better or for worse, right? It's very hard to believe that you are generating some hugely massive deterrent effect on crime when the average cop in a high crime city like Chicago is making literally just 3 arrests. And I think a big part of what cops are doing is basically serving this eye on the street function. And once you sort of realize that, then if you're a police leader, you can start to give your people more guidance about what you want them to do and what you don't want them to do. I don't want the 3 arrests to be nonsense zero tolerance arrests, right? That's not going to be the thing that's actually going to be helpful. Save your 3 arrests for something more serious, and the rest of the time stay out on the street so you can help diffuse conflict when it happens and that sort of stuff.
And this, I think, also relates to data. I mean, used correctly, right? That if you're, everybody cares what they're being measured on, right? So if you're being measured on arrests, you'll arrest people. If you're being measured on like neighborhood level outcomes, you will try to think about what will generate a beneficial outcome, which is maybe just like yelling at somebody, like, hey, knock it off, or standing by the liquor store, whatever sort of the case may be. You also talk in the book about a few other sort of like order adjacent things, right? Like cleaning up vacant lots, like brighter street lights, right? There's all these kind of, I want to say superficial, but like ways to make a neighborhood have like an appealing, like calm vibe.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, another way to say that is there's surprisingly huge importance from environmental changes that you would probably not in a million years think are important for gun violence. And so, like, as Matt mentioned, like seemingly little things like, cleaning up vacant lots to turn them into little pocket parks, improving street lighting, as I mentioned before, whether there are stores open or not in a neighborhood. These are not like small things for gun violence. These are big things. So we have a bunch of experimental evidence that suggests that these things can reduce shootings in that proximate area by like 10 or 20 or 30%. So now imagine that you do both lights and clean up the lot and get some stores in there. And then you're doing like behavioral science programs with people in detention in the public schools. And you're just stacking 10, 20, 30% gains on top of each other. You're starting to really move the needle on this gun violence, this seemingly intractable gun violence problem.
And you, I think is the phrase like community efficacy, right? That this is right. You're trying to create both a sense and a reality that like there are responsible stakeholders in every community, but that those people are like in charge, right? Fundamentally, the like, I don't know, like adult women who live places and are not shooting people. Sort of like have some command over the space.
Yeah, exactly. One of the most influential papers of the 20th century in sociology was by Rob Sampson, Steve Radenbush, and Tony Earls, arguing that the key explanator for variation across neighborhoods and violence is collective efficacy. That I think one of the ways to think about this behavioral economics explanation is it helps us tie together a bunch of seemingly different things from different fields about what drives gun violence. You can sort like collective efficacy in sociology. Urban planning people have been talking about the importance of the built environment. Like criminologists have been arguing like police presence really matters. Like a bunch of these things that seem very different and disconnected now kind of make sense once you've got this kind of system one view of gun violence rather than thinking it's all sort of deliberate incentive-driven behavior.
Right. So I wanted to open this up for some questions from the audience. Here, Yes, please.
One is a
we've
practical,
got a mic.
excuse me. One is a practical question. So what does the violence interrupter, how does that person operate? Are they just out on the street looking, or are they in an institution?
Yeah. So
And how do you find somebody who would be good at this?
I think what they wind up doing in practice is hiring a lot of people who have some prior criminal justice involvement, you know, people who are in gangs, and that's the sort of, I think the phrase that they use is credible messengers. So, you know, someone who's both a credible messenger and also has some sort of understanding of what's going on. And, you know, I think a lot of what they do is use sort of street intelligence to figure out what they could do. I also think that there's like a lot of value. One of the hardest things that we've seen in Chicago is to get the police department to cooperate with these nonprofits. And let me just tell you a very quick story about how I came to believe that that's like super important. So I'm in the back of a police car on the south side of Chicago one night, and a call comes in for a huge brawl in the middle of the street. So lights and sirens, and they floor it, and we're going like 70 miles an hour over service streets. This thing, we show up, huge group of people fighting in the middle of the street, yelling. Sergeant gets out, says, everybody shut the fuck up. What's going on? And so it turns out that like this teenage girl on this side of the street had been dating this teenage boy on this side of the street. Somebody broke up with somebody else. Somebody in the girl's family thought it would be a great idea to walk across the street, walk into the boy's house, and punch him in the face in front of his whole family. And then it's just chaos. And so the cops say, they figure out what's going on. They say, look, everybody go back into your house. If we've got to come back, we're arresting all y'all. And then we get in the car, and then they drive off. And I turned to the sergeant and I said, so you can see, like, that's violence. They didn't arrest anybody in the moment. That's violence interruption. We get in the car. I say to the sergeant, like, do you think that worked? Do you think you put a lid on this? He was like, oh, definitely not. Like, there's going to be a shooting on that block for sure. I was like, why are we leaving? He was like, are you listening to the police radio? Like, on the south side of Chicago on a Friday night in the summer, it's like literally every 15, 20 minutes, there's a shots fired or man with a gun call. And that's what they're racing around to. You can see the huge value of coordination as like the cops come in and settle everything down in the moment. Why wouldn't you want coordination to have a community violence intervention organization then come through? And like this family on this side of the street's got to live with this other family on the other side of the street. Right? They've got to figure out some way to live. Like, you just can't be fighting in the street all the time. So someone's got to come in and figure out how to mediate that. The cops are not the right people to do that. Something else, and that something else has to be, I think, this other thing.
A lot of people here. Here. Yeah.
So if your view is that the eye on the street function is the main thing that cops are doing, then is there a material difference between, you know, Cuomo is calling for hiring 5,000 more cops in New York City. On the other end, you have a socialist candidate who's calling for basically having more, you know, violence interrupter type people or mental health professionals in the subway. Is there a material difference between these two things? And I also have one more question, which is, what do you think primarily was responsible for the decline in crime in New York City from the 90s to the present? Because this is still a hotly contested empirical question.
Yeah, I mean, as I said before, I think it's New York City was an early and rapid adopter of data-driven policing, and community violence intervention would be my personal hypothesis for what was going on. I think, you know, I think I am a super pragmatist, right? And I can see that people have like super strongly held political views, and they vary enormously across person and across cities. And I think like the great thing about the behavioral economics perspective to this problem is that it is highly politically malleable in the sense that there are lots and lots of different types of people who can serve as eyes on the street, right? If you are in Dallas, Texas, and you said, hey guys, I'm the mayor of Dallas, I've got a great idea. I want to hire a bunch of people who are just out of prison with city money and have them serve as community violence interrupters, my guess would be that Dallas voters are not going to be super enthusiastic compared to, I'm the mayor and I want to hire a bunch more cops. Great, go hire a bunch more cops. In New York City, like the data suggests that like unarmed private security guards can also be, we've got really, really good evidence that suggests that it doesn't need to be a cop. security guards, violence interrupter, neighbor walking around in the store or whatever. In New York City, given the politics here, maybe you don't want to hire 5,000 more cops, hire 5,000 more of whatever else instead, right? And so I think like the spirit of more eyes on the street directionally is the right one. The particular form that that takes is like, there are multiple paths to success.
I want to ask you about security guards because
Yeah.
you mentioned this in the book, and the statistical evidence on security guards is really good. Obviously, lots of people are hiring security guards with their own money. Something I perceived in the past few years is that it seemed like kind of like word got out on social media that the rent-a-cops and the CVS weren't actually going to stop you if you were shoplifting, and that like nothing changed in reality, but like the information environment changed, and it seemed to me that like radically degraded the efficacy of those
Yeah.
guards.
Let me zoom up one level, Matt, and I think there's a very deep point in what you're saying, which is like in some ways the word crime is an unhelpfully broad term. It's almost like disease. You know, what causes disease? Well, are we talking about cancer or pneumonia or COVID or whatever, right? And it's like a very heterogeneous collection of underlying things that we put one, and I think crime is the same way. And I would say there's lots of very good evidence to suggest that property offending really does have a very different kind of behavioral determinant than violent offending, right? And so like the people who are going into the CVS in Chicago, it's like you wouldn't be charged with a felony unless it was $1,000 or more in merchandise. The gang that's going into the CVS and everybody is loading up their duffel bag with $990 worth of stuff, they're not the people who are acting on system one. I'm not surprised that the security guard sort of stepping in is like their system two is already committed to that activity, unlike the one University of Chicago professor arguing with the other University of Chicago professor. The private security guard is serving a very different function of like reminding you your system two probably does not really want this to go in this direction, kind of thing.
Right. So the point is that this kind of lethal interpersonal violence is special in a lot of ways. Here, so there in the back.
Yeah, thanks. You've actually mentioned something, and it's sort of piggybacking on the earlier question about the difference between armed and unarmed police officers. And to the extent, if you could talk about any research on whether or not communities who are constantly met with armed police officers in the South Side of Chicago experience higher rates of this sort of like violent gun activity versus communities who are met with a kind violence interrupter. Is there any information you can talk about in that context?
Yeah, I think what you might be getting at a little bit is like what I was saying before. Like if you were the mayor of New York City and you were allocating the marginal $1 million to, should you hire more police or should you hire more security guards or violence interrupters or whatever. So I tried to do this calculation myself to figure out like the crime prevention per dollar spent on private security guards and cops. And it just wasn't possible because the studies are using sort of different outcome measures and whatever. So I would say like, I don't know. I don't know like I think the one thing that you would say that is an advantage of that, like the downside risk of private security guards is much different from the downside risk of cops. The flip side is in an active shooter situation, the unarmed private security guards are much less helpful. And so I don't know myself. The data aren't clear about what's the best use of the marginal $1 million at this point. Sorry, you've got a mic right there.
Yeah, good. Mic for you.
Okay, thank you. Question on the efficacy of different forms of violence interruption. Like I deeply resonate as a professor myself with the idea that talking to violence-prone people, public schools, criminal justice about system one and system two is a good thing to do. But given the predominance of system one in the relevant population, don't we have to be open to the idea that it might be better to use more intense ideological approaches. So ratio ethnic solidarity, the man is trying to divide us, gangs are bad, or how about, other, efforts. I don't think this would work as well, my priors tell me, but this is being the wrong kind of man. It's toxic masculinity. Or, yes, Jesus, Allah. So I would really hope, and I want to hear from you on what research has been done on like the efficacy of the sort of rational strategy. Tell people about Kahneman, Tversky, only you don't act like a professor. You just try to adjust people's thinking compared to folks who may have a deep predilection for system one and might be more reachable with racial ethnic solidarity messages or religious messages. I'm interested in the research, and I hope you do it if it hasn't been done enough.
Yeah.
Or
So
yeah.
Do we need Jesus?
do we know whether the NSA is monitoring the Zoom feed before I answer? Yeah. So let me answer this way. The good news is that I am not the person designing or delivering these programs. I think one of the big things that I really came to appreciate, and working in Chicago for the last nearly 20 years, is there are conventional wisdom has gotten this totally wrong, but practitioners who see the problem up close have seen this problem for what it is for a long time. And, we have found amazingly clever nonprofits all over the city of Chicago who've come up with what they think is the right sort of program for the populations that they work with. And, when we do randomized experiments with some of these nonprofits, you can see changes in, whether these things scale or not, I think is the open question. But in demonstration projects, you can see reductions in violent crime as large as like 50%. Now, I don't know if there are any changes to those programs that could make the 50% into 60% or 70% or 80%, right? Like, I don't know. I would say this is the early stage of this sort of policy agenda, not the end of it. And so we'll see. But in a world in which the murder rate today is the same as it was in 1900, having a bunch of programs that reduce violence rates by 50% is not a bad start.
Right. So, here.
Yeah. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Matt.
Well, we talked about this at the beginning, but I mean, I think you think if we could nationally reduce the amount of guns, that would be much more effective than these kind of locally focused measures.
Yeah, I mean, I think, or let me say that, let me add a friendly amendment. If there were anything that we could do to materially change gun availability, that would help. I think the challenge is that the politics in the United States are such that that's enormously difficult. And I think, my view of this is such a huge I really do think that this gun violence problem sits upstream of every other problem that cities face because it drives people and businesses out. It makes everything else so hard to solve. So given the importance of this, I would say we should not be putting all of our eggs in the gun control basket. It seems crazy to me to not diversify our bet and also worry about the violent behavior side as a complement to, not substitute for, worrying about gun availability.
I don't have a mic, but I'm a loudspeaker, so. I was wondering if you could speak to the relationship between gun violence and masculinity. And you could call that toxic masculinity, but just the nature of gender and violence as well. And on a broader level, maybe you can speak to it however you would like.
Yeah, I mean, the two strongest predictors of gun violence involvement, either as a victim or offender, is gender and age, right? And you know, the guy who developed the very first social program that we studied is called Becoming a Man. The nonprofit was Youth Guidance in Chicago. The guy who developed that clearly thought helping people think about masculinity and what that means is an important part of the program. I think, you know, to the previous question, I think we have not been able to yet reverse engineer what specific aspects of the content of these programs is most important. So I don't know to what degree that really is important or not important at this stage. Like, we're testing a bundle of stuff and the bundle helps, but which components help, we don't know.
I mean, I do think that, you know, on the one hand, it's like everybody knows, I think, that like men are committing large preponderance of violence, that there's younger men. But then people don't always incorporate that, right? So like women are poor at a higher rate than men, right? And also, we know that people don't like magically become more deterrable when they get old, right? What happens is they become like calmer, right? Or wiser, maybe I like to think of myself, right? And just if you,
At the very least, older.
right, but I mean, if you ponder those kind of broad demographic facts, I mean, you can see that it's people are dealing with self-control issues. It's irrational kinds of behavior that we can maybe shape in certain kinds of ways, but it's not that men and women face drastically different objective material incentives, but they're behaving very different.
And they certainly don't face different criminal justice systems either.
No. Oh wow, that's like cheating.
I had like just first a theoretical setup question, which is, you know, you dismiss very rightly so the rational actor model as being outdated, a black box that could be expanded through behavioral science. Super. But however, it seems to me, and it always has seemed to me, to be a subset of the rational actor model, only further expanded. What seems to me in your behavioral approaches to be curiously unanswered, and maybe just because you're focused on the U.S. question, is the comparative analyses that have been done by people like Edward Glasser. I think it's Global Cities, my memory fails. They compare the crime rates in, like, let's say, Brazilian favelas, and as you mentioned, in fact, luckily, to Turkish slums and famously to Bombay slums and Dharvi. And what they notice is not only just the levels of crime are lower in Dharvi, in Turkey, compared to, actually, I forget, there's also Nairobi included in the study, compared to Nairobi and the favelas in Brazil, but also things like, you know, families staying together, teenage pregnancy rates, all sorts of, let's say, that broader heterogeneous crime family are much lower. There is greater social cohesion, and all of those things seem to create a virtuous cycle by which people are actually moving out of those slums. Whereas what we find in the poorer areas of Chicago, let's say, maybe in New York, that cycle of poverty is not ending. And so, you know, I don't want to go all, you know, Moynihan on you, and, you know, sort of just lay it all at the feet of some sort of cultural explanation. But it does seem that a behavioral model that is predominantly focused on environment, and even you know, and the Jane Jacobs study, for example, is not robust enough when you do cross-comparative analysis on it to, like, Bogota, for example. I can't remember the study.
I can totally see the direction that you're going. So I think, it's super helpful. I think, you know, one thing that I take from looking across countries is, like, there you can really see that poverty is not crime destiny. because the murder rate in India is like nothing compared to the United States. And it is very, whatever you think of the poverty problem in the United States, India would be delighted to have our poverty problem by comparison, right? I think the second thing that I take away from the, going back to the question about gun availability, I think the second thing that I take away from the cross-country comparisons is like, given that gun violence is guns plus violence, like there are a bunch of countries around the world that have, relatively speaking, a bunch of violent crime and not many guns, like the United Kingdom. They've got a very low murder rate. You've got a bunch of countries around the world that have a lot of guns and not much violent crime, like Switzerland. They've got a pretty low murder rate. And then you've got countries that are like, have the worst of all worlds, a lot of violent crime and a lot of guns, and that's what gets you sort of the United States.
Yeah, I mean, famously, Yemen doesn't have that much of a crime problem, but has 6 times as many guns.
Right. Okay, one last question there in the back. And,
this question here, what really drives gun violence and how we stop it, is really a complex question, especially to me, relatively on how we are asking that question. Are we asking that in the American gun violence way, or more or less how I hear you talking about black and brown communities, right or wrong, right? So what really drives gun violence? And off the research, I have done research on this, right? In New York here, interviewed 330 shooters around New York, and then did it on a larger scale in Detroit, Wilmington, Philly, and Crown Heights. So to this question, and my answer is we're gonna have to look through the lens of racism, right? And all that applies there. You cannot talk about what drives gun violence in black and brown communities without looking in the timeline of structural racism, white supremacy, and understanding all those dynamics and all those challenges that have played in the timeline on what we're dealing with today, right? So even for when you was talking about environment, right? That's just one component of structural racism that drives this very question, right? I hear you talking about lights and all that, but it's even little more things to that. It's just the garbage around you, right? It's the projects and how they are structured, right? It's the lack of finances and the lack of resources to be able to get jobs, right? So when we look at that, and I hear you talk about like getting the individual out the neighborhood, and they were thriving. That was the case, nobody would be in their neighborhood. You understand what I'm saying? So like,
right.
the question I want to rephrase and really want to look through the lens of who is, like we all know that in our research and what we understand it, we have really been studying the victims of structural racism, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
We really understand that, but why don't we look through the lens of who's really the perpetrator?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's-
I totally,
let's-
thank you. I totally get the question. I totally like, as I said before, like when you look around the city of Chicago, to exactly to your point, when you look around the city of Chicago, the gun violence is concentrated overwhelmingly on the south and west sides, low income and predominantly black neighborhoods. And all of the reasons that everybody in this room knows of, like why that is where the disadvantage is concentrated and so on. And I think the way to hear what I'm trying to call for in the book is like solving that problem. Chicago's been wrestling with that problem for 100 years, right? And that has led us to a murder rate that has like not changed at all in Chicago over this 100-year period. I think the argument of my book is like there's a bunch of other things that, like, given this really difficult sort of social background, there are a bunch of pragmatic things that we can do to make life on the south and west sides of Chicago much, much safer for the people who live there, that while we are working on solving these other social problems, we can save a bunch of lives in the meantime, if that makes sense. Like there's other, it's like a yes and there's a bunch of other stuff that's much more pragmatic and solvable that we can do as a complement to addressing these larger problems in the background.
you're advising the mayor of New York or a mayor of any city, you're talking about bringing together like different functions or different areas that have been pretty disparate. Like we saw the Biden administration give millions and millions of dollars, I think, to almost 20 cities for criminal violence interruption that largely got put into offices of violence prevention. You talk about a big data function. You talk about a police function. What in your view is a way to bring those different functions together? Who do you think overseeing it? Like structurally, what would bringing your vision to life look like for cities?
Yeah, let me just go back to like, I am ridiculously pragmatic. And like the one thing, my research center at the University of Chicago Crime Lab, like I didn't know anything about anything 20 years ago when we started this. It's embarrassing how dumb I was at the time, and maybe still am, I don't know. And I think the first lesson of city politics that I learned is everybody hates everybody. And even getting people within the same city agency to cooperate with one another is almost impossible. And getting different city agencies to cooperate with each other is literally impossible, in my experience. Maybe Chicago is unusually dysfunctional or whatever,
It's
right?
not, no.
And so the thing that I like about this sort of behavioral economics perspective is there are a bunch of things that you can do that can run on parallel tracks that don't require a ton of coordination and still be effective. Because in my experience, anything that requires a ton of coordination is just never going to happen. So it's fine. Like it's great to have some attempt to coordinate, but I don't think that that's like a necessary condition.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
All right, I think we're out of time here, but so thank you so much, Jens. It's a wonderful book. Everybody
Matt.
should read it. Most importantly, you should buy it. Tell your friends to buy it. And yeah, thank you so much.